The air was thick, suffocating, as if the jungle itself was breathing down on them. Private First Class Michael Torres wiped the sweat from his brow, his hand trembling slightly as he scanned the dense vegetation ahead. It was June 1967, and his platoon had been moving through the Mekong Delta for 3 days straight. Every step a negotiation with mud, water, and an enemy they couldn't see. The temperature hovered around 95 degrees, but the humidity made it feel like wading through warm soup. Torres's uniform was soaked through, clinging to his skin like a second layer of flesh he desperately wanted to shed. His M16 felt heavier with each passing hour, and the weight of his pack had long since become an extension of his exhausted body. He didn't know it yet, but the greatest threat that day wouldn't come from the Viet Cong. It wouldn't come from booby traps or ambushes or the sudden crack of enemy fire. It would come from something far smaller, something ancient, something the jungle had been perfecting for millions of years. Sergeant William Hayes raised his fist, and the column of 12 men froze. In the silence that followed, Torres could hear his own heartbeat, the distant call of some unidentified bird, and the persistent hum of insects that had become the constant soundtrack of his existence in this green hell. "Take 5, Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible. "But stay alert." Torres lowered himself onto a fallen log, his muscles screaming with relief. He reached for his canteen, took a long drink of warm water that tasted vaguely of metal and chemicals, and closed his eyes for just a moment. That was when he felt it. A sharp, burning sensation on his left calf just above the top of his boot. At first he thought it was just another mosquito bite, another of the thousands he'd accumulated since arriving in country. But this was different. This pain was immediate, intense, and spreading. He looked down and saw it, a centipede the length of his forearm, its segmented body a nightmarish combination of dark red and black, its countless legs still moving as it disappeared into the undergrowth. The creature had been hiding in the rotting log, disturbed by Torres's weight, and it had defended itself the only way it knew how. "Sarge," Torres said, his voice suddenly weak, "something bit me." Hayes was at his side in seconds, pulling up the trouser leg to reveal 2 puncture marks already surrounded by an angry red welt. The skin around the bite was swelling rapidly, and Torres could feel a strange numbness beginning to creep up from his ankle. "Centipede," Hayes said, his jaw tight. "A big one." What happened next would become a story passed down through the ranks. A warning whispered in fire-base bunkers and scrawled in letters home. Within 15 minutes, Private First Class Michael Torres could no longer feel his left leg. Within 30 minutes, the paralysis had spread to his right leg. Within an hour, he was lying on a makeshift stretcher, his arms growing heavy, his breathing becoming labored. His eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the enemy. He remained that way for 5 hours. 5 hours of complete helplessness in the middle of hostile territory. 5 hours during which his platoon had to carry him through terrain that was already nearly impossible to navigate. 5 hours during which every member of that unit learned a lesson that no training back in the States had ever taught them. In Vietnam, the jungle itself was the enemy, and it had weapons they never could have imagined. The giant centipede that bit Torres that day was Scolopendra subspinipes, known to locals as the Vietnamese giant centipede. It could grow up to 8 inches long, and its venom, while rarely fatal to healthy adults, was capable of causing intense pain, swelling, fever, and in some cases temporary paralysis that could last for hours. But Torres's encounter was just one small piece of a much larger nightmare. Throughout the Vietnam War, American soldiers faced an enemy they hadn't trained for, couldn't shoot, and often couldn't even see until it was too late. The insects and arachnids of Southeast Asia would claim no official body count, but their impact on morale, combat effectiveness, and the psychological well-being of thousands of young Americans would prove to be devastating, in ways the Pentagon never fully acknowledged. This is the story of those creatures, the tiny terrors that turned the Vietnamese jungle into a house of horrors. The venomous inhabitants that left battle-hardened soldiers screaming in pain, and the microscopic killers that would claim more American lives than enemy bullets ever did. To understand what these men faced, we must first understand the environment they were sent into. Vietnam's jungles were not simply forests with thicker vegetation. They were complete ecosystems that had evolved for millions of years without significant human interference, producing species of remarkable size, aggression, and toxicity. The climate, hot, humid, and relentlessly wet during monsoon season, created perfect breeding conditions for insects in numbers and varieties that soldiers from temperate North America could never have imagined. The average American soldier came from cities like Detroit, Chicago, or Los Angeles, or from rural towns in the Midwest where the most dangerous insect was perhaps a hornet or a black widow spider. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for what awaited in the jungles of Southeast Asia. From the moment they stepped off the transport planes at Tan Son Nhat or Da Nang, they entered a world where the very air seemed alive with crawling, buzzing, biting creatures. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick they could be inhaled. Leeches dropped from trees and rose from stagnant water. Ants the size of a man's thumbnail marched in columns across the jungle floor, capable of stripping the flesh from small animals. Spiders with leg spans wider than a human hand built webs strong enough to feel like walking into fishing line. And then there were the centipedes. The story of Private Torres would be repeated with variations thousands of times throughout the war. The Vietnamese giant centipede was just one of several species that inhabited the region, but it was the one most likely to send a soldier to the field hospital. Its venom contained a cocktail of toxins including serotonin, histamine, and cardiotoxic proteins that could cause symptoms ranging from severe localized pain to systemic reactions including nausea, vomiting, fever, and the temporary paralysis that Torres experienced. The paralysis, when it occurred, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. A soldier who couldn't move was a soldier who couldn't fight, couldn't run, couldn't even crawl to cover if an ambush came. In the chaos of jungle warfare, where contact with the enemy could happen at any moment, the psychological impact of sudden helplessness was as damaging as the physical symptoms. Sergeant Hayes never forgot what he saw in Torres's eyes during those 5 hours, not just fear, but a kind of primal terror that came from being trapped inside a body that had stopped responding to commands. Torres would later describe it as feeling like being buried alive inside his own flesh, fully conscious but completely unable to move. Forced to lie there and wonder if the paralysis would spread to his heart or his lungs. Forced to listen for the sounds of approaching enemy soldiers, knowing he would be utterly defenseless if they came. The platoon's medic, Corporal James Washington, did what he could with the limited resources available. He cleaned the wound, applied a cold compress to slow the spread of venom, and monitored Torres's vital signs while the rest of the unit took turns carrying the stretcher through terrain that seemed designed to make human movement as difficult as possible. They moved slowly, too slowly, each man knowing that they were vulnerable, that their combat effectiveness had been cut by the loss of one rifle and the burden of carrying a helpless comrade. The sound of their movement through the undergrowth seemed impossibly loud, and every man's nerves were stretched to the breaking point, waiting for the ambush that might come at any moment. It never came. The Viet Cong, if they were in the area, chose not to engage. Perhaps they were waiting for better conditions. Or perhaps they had their own reasons for avoiding that particular stretch of jungle that day. Torres would never know, and in a way, that uncertainty was its own kind of torture, the knowledge that his helplessness might have invited an attack that would have killed them all. By the time they reached the fire base, Torres was beginning to regain sensation in his extremities. The paralysis retreated slowly, like a tide going out, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound that he slept for 18 hours straight once the medics had finished their examination. He would spend another week in the field hospital, recovering from the secondary effects of the venom and the deep tissue damage around the bite site. The scar on his calf would remain for the rest of his life, a reminder of the day the jungle taught him that death in Vietnam didn't always come from the barrel of a gun. But Torres was lucky. He survived. He recovered. He returned to his unit and served out his tour, eventually rotating home to a country that didn't want to hear about what he'd experienced. Many others weren't so fortunate. The insects and arachnids of Vietnam would continue to claim their victims throughout the war, each bite and sting another small tragedy in a conflict already overflowing with horror. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. The stories we tell here are the ones that history forgot, the truths too painful to print in textbooks. The experiences of men who fought not just the enemy, but the very environment that was trying to kill them. Subscribe now, because every soldier's story deserves to be remembered. The medical reports began piling up in 1965, and by 1966 they had become impossible to ignore. Army doctors in Vietnam were seeing something unprecedented, a pattern of injuries and illnesses that had nothing to do with combat, but was having a measurable impact on unit readiness and troop morale. Captain Sarah Mitchell, a military entomologist stationed at the research facility in Saigon, would later recall the moment she realized the scale of the problem. She'd been reviewing medical evacuation statistics when she noticed an anomaly. In certain regions and during certain seasons, non-combat injuries and illnesses were actually exceeding combat casualties. "We were losing more men to bugs than to bullets," she would write in her classified report, dated September 1966, and we weren't prepared for it. We weren't prepared at all. The scope of the threat was staggering. In a single year, malaria transmitted by mosquitoes would hospitalize more than 100,000 American servicemen. Another disease carried by mosquitoes, dengue fever, would incapacitate thousands more with symptoms so severe that soldiers called it breakbone fever for the way it made them feel like every bone in their body was being shattered. But mosquitoes were just the beginning. The jungles of Vietnam hosted an estimated 3,000 species of insects, many of which had never been formally cataloged by Western science. Among them were species of remarkable size and aggression, creatures that had evolved in an environment of intense competition for resources and had developed formidable defenses. Centipedes were perhaps the most feared. In addition to the giant Vietnamese centipede that had paralyzed Private Torres, soldiers encountered at least 4 other species capable of delivering venomous bites. The smaller species were actually more dangerous in some ways. Their size allowed them to hide in boots, under blankets, and in the folds of clothing, making them almost impossible to avoid. Standard procedure became checking every piece of equipment before use, every morning and after every rest stop. Soldiers learned to shake out their boots, turn their helmets upside down before putting them on, and never, under any circumstances, to sit or lie down without first examining the ground beneath them. Even with these precautions, bites remained common. The symptoms varied depending on the species, the size of the centipede, and the individual soldier's reaction to the venom. Most bites resulted in intense localized pain, described by victims as feeling like being stabbed with a red-hot needle. Swelling and redness around the bite site were universal, and many soldiers developed fever and nausea that could last for days. But the cases that truly terrified the troops were the ones like Torres, the bites that resulted in paralysis. Medical researchers would eventually determine that this reaction was relatively rare, occurring in perhaps 1 in 20 significant centipede envenomations. But in a war zone where tens of thousands of soldiers were exposed to the risk daily, relatively rare still meant dozens of cases each month. The psychological impact extended far beyond the actual victims. Stories spread through the ranks, growing more horrific with each retelling. By 1967, the Vietnamese giant centipede had achieved an almost mythological status among American soldiers, a creature that could appear without warning, strike with devastating effect, and leave a healthy young man as helpless as an infant. Some soldiers began to develop phobias so severe they affected their ability to function. Military psychiatrists documented cases of men who couldn't sleep, convinced that centipedes were crawling toward them in the darkness. Others became so obsessed with checking their equipment and surroundings that they were unable to maintain proper alertness for actual combat threats. The irony was not lost on the men who experienced it. They had been trained to face one of the most determined and skilled enemies in modern warfare, and yet many of them lived in greater fear of a creature that fit in the palm of their hand. But the centipedes were far from the only threat. The Vietnamese jungle was also home to some of the most venomous spiders in Southeast Asia. Chief among them was the Heteropoda venatoria, the giant huntsman spider, which could achieve leg spans of up to 12 inches. While technically not as dangerous as its reputation suggested, its venom was rarely harmful to humans. A psychological impact of encountering a spider the size of a dinner plate was profound. Soldiers reported finding these creatures in their bunkers, their tents, even inside vehicles and helicopters. The huntsman spider was primarily nocturnal, which meant it was most active during the hours when exhausted soldiers were trying to sleep. Many men would wake to find one of these enormous arachnids crawling across their chest or face, an experience that frequently resulted in screaming, panic, and in several documented cases, accidental discharge of weapons. More dangerous, though less visually dramatic, were the various species of cobweb spiders that inhabited the region. Their bites could cause necrosis, the death of tissue around the bite site, which often led to secondary infections in the jungle environment. These infections could spread rapidly in the heat and humidity, sometimes requiring amputation if not treated promptly. Then there were the scorpions. Vietnam's scorpion population included several species capable of delivering painful and sometimes dangerous stings. The most common was Heterometrus longimanus, the Asian forest scorpion, which could grow up to 5 inches in length and was frequently found in the same rotting logs and debris piles where soldiers sought shelter or concealment. Scorpion stings were typically not life-threatening to healthy adults, but they were extraordinarily painful and could cause a range of systemic symptoms including elevated heart rate, difficulty breathing, and muscle spasms. In combat conditions, even these non-fatal effects could prove disastrous. Sergeant Robert Chun, who served with the 1st Cavalry Division in 1968, would later describe an incident that illustrated the cascading consequences of these attacks. During a night ambush, one of his men was stung by a scorpion that had been hiding in the grass where the soldier lay in wait. He tried to stay quiet, Chun recalled. He knew if he made a sound, he'd give away our position. But the pain was too much. He screamed, and suddenly there was gunfire everywhere. We lost 2 men that night, and I'll always wonder if those deaths trace back to that one scorpion sting. Stories like Chun's were common, though rarely discussed in official histories of the war. The creature attacks didn't fit neatly into narratives of heroism and sacrifice, of battles won and lost. They were random, senseless, and deeply embarrassing to a military establishment that prided itself on preparation and control. Yet the numbers couldn't be ignored. By 1968, military medical researchers estimated that insect and arachnid attacks were responsible for more than 50,000 man-days lost each month, time during which soldiers were incapacitated, receiving treatment, or recovering from attacks that had nothing to do with the enemy they had been sent to fight. The Army's response was characteristically bureaucratic. Memoranda circulated through the chain of command. Studies were commissioned. Equipment was redesigned to better protect against insect infiltration. New insect repellents were developed and distributed, though their effectiveness in the Vietnamese climate was limited. They sweated off within hours. And their strong chemical smell was believed by many soldiers to make them easier for the enemy to detect. Training protocols were updated to include basic instruction on the creatures soldiers might encounter, but these lessons were often superficial and quickly forgotten in the chaos of actual deployment. Most men learned about the dangers of Vietnamese insects and arachnids the hard way through personal experience or by watching their friends suffer. The creatures themselves, of course, were entirely indifferent to the geopolitical conflict unfolding in their habitat. They attacked Americans and Vietnamese alike, their venom making no distinction between soldier and civilian, between ally and enemy. In this sense, they were perhaps the most neutral participants in the entire war, ancient organisms simply doing what they had always done, defending their territory and hunting their prey. But to the young Americans who found themselves in that jungle, the creatures felt like an additional enemy, a second front in a war that was already overwhelming. The jungle wasn't just concealing the Viet Cong. It was actively hostile, filled with organisms that seemed designed to cause maximum suffering. Private First Class David Morrison, who served with the 25th Infantry Division in 1967, would articulate this feeling in a letter home that was later included in a collection of soldiers' correspondence. "You ask me what it's like here, and I don't know how to explain it. It's not just the fighting, it's everything. The heat that never stops. The rain that comes out of nowhere and soaks you to the bone. And the bugs, Mom, the bugs are everywhere. They bite you and sting you and crawl on you while you're trying to sleep. Some of them can kill you or put you in the hospital for weeks. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't shoot them. You can't call in artillery on them. You just have to live with them, knowing that any moment one of them might get you. It's like the whole jungle's trying to make you miserable, and it's winning." Morrison survived his tour. He came home with a Purple Heart for a wound received during a firefight near Su Chi. But he would later admit that his most vivid memories of Vietnam weren't of combat. They were of the nights spent lying awake, listening to the endless buzz and chirp of insects, wondering which one would get him next. The legacy of this invisible army would extend far beyond the war itself. Many veterans returned home with chronic conditions directly or indirectly related to insect attacks. Some carried tropical diseases that would flare up for years, even decades after their service. Others bore the psychological scars of experiences that seemed almost impossible to explain to those who hadn't been there. How do you tell someone about the terror of paralysis from a centipede bite? How do you explain the horror of waking with a spider the size of your hand on your face? How do you convey the grinding, cumulative effect of being bitten and stung and crawled upon, day after day, month after month, until the very sound of buzzing wings makes you flinch? These were the questions that haunted Vietnam veterans, and for many, they remained unanswerable. The official record counted 47 documented cases of centipede-induced paralysis among American soldiers in Vietnam between 1965 and 1,972. The actual number was certainly higher. Many incidents in remote areas were never properly reported, and the chaotic conditions of jungle warfare meant that medical records were often incomplete or lost entirely. But even the documented cases were enough to create a pattern of fear that spread through the American military presence like the venom itself. The paralysis typically followed a predictable progression. First came the bites, sudden, shocking, almost always unexpected. Then came the immediate pain, described by victims as among the worst they had ever experienced. Within minutes, the area around the bite would begin to swell and grow numb. The numbness would spread, gradually at first, then with increasing speed. In most cases, the paralysis remained localized, a single limb, perhaps two, but in the most severe cases it could spread throughout the body, leaving the victim conscious but almost entirely unable to move. Breathing typically remained unaffected, as did heart function, but everything else, arms, legs, head, Facial muscles could become temporarily immobilized. The duration varied, but 5 hours was about average for severe cases. Some soldiers recovered more quickly. Others remained paralyzed for up to 12 hours. In every case, the experience was described as absolutely terrifying. Corporal James Jimmy Patterson was 21 years old when he experienced his paralysis incident in March 1968. His unit had been operating in the Central Highlands, conducting search and destroy missions in some of the most challenging terrain in Vietnam. They had been in the field for 9 days straight, and exhaustion had dulled their alertness. Patterson had sat down to rest against what he thought was a solid tree trunk. What he didn't see was the narrow gap in the bark where a Vietnamese giant centipede had made its home. When his weight pressed against the gap, the creature responded with instinctive aggression. "It felt like someone had stabbed me with a knife that was on fire," Patterson would later recall. "I jumped up, but it was already too late. I could see the thing crawling away, and I knew right then that something bad was going to happen." Within 20 minutes, Patterson had lost all sensation in his right arm and shoulder. Within 45 minutes, he could no longer stand. His platoon leader, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, made the decision to call for a medevac, but the nearest clearing large enough for a helicopter was more than 2 kilometers away through dense jungle. "We had to carry him," Webb recalled. "And he was dead weight by then. Couldn't help at all. His eyes were open, and you could see he was aware of everything that was happening, but he couldn't move a muscle. It was like carrying a corpse that could still look at you." The extraction took 3 hours. Patterson lay on the improvised stretcher the entire time, watching the jungle canopy pass above him, listening to the grunts and curses of the men carrying him, unable to do anything but wait and hope. He would later describe those hours as the loneliest of his life. "You can't imagine what it's like," he said in a 1983 interview, "being completely helpless like that, knowing that if the enemy came you couldn't do anything, knowing that the guys carrying you were risking their lives because of something stupid that happened to you, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing you can do about it. You're just a passenger in your own body." Patterson's paralysis began to subside about an hour after he reached the field hospital. Full recovery took another 36 hours, during which he experienced muscle weakness, fatigue, and recurring waves of nausea. The physical effects eventually faded, but the psychological impact remained. "I was never the same after that," he admitted. "Every time I sat down in the jungle, I was looking for centipedes. Every time something brushed against my skin, I thought I was being bitten. I couldn't relax out there anymore. And I know I wasn't the only one." Patterson was right. The paralysis incidents created a ripple effect through the units where they occurred. Men who witnessed a comrade become suddenly helpless, reduced to dead weight by a creature smaller than a pistol, carried that image with them. It added another layer of dread to an environment that was already saturated with fear. The military's response was inadequate, partly because there was no adequate response. There was no vaccine against centipede venom, no antidote that could be administered in the field, no way to prevent the attacks short of leaving the jungle entirely. Medical officers could only advise soldiers to be vigilant, to check their surroundings, to avoid sitting or lying on dead vegetation, advice that was often impractical given the realities of jungle warfare. Some units experimented with their own solutions. The 4th Infantry Division, operating near Pleiku, developed a protocol of burning the ground around their night perimeter positions, hoping to drive away creatures with the smell of smoke and the heat of small fires. It may have helped marginally, but it also gave away their positions to enemy observers and consumed time and resources that were already in short supply. Other soldiers turned to superstition. Lucky charms, rituals, and prayers became common among men who had never been particularly religious or superstitious before. Some carried small bottles of ammonia or vinegar, believing incorrectly that these substances could neutralize centipede venom. Others wore their trouser legs tucked into their boots and bound with rubber bands, creating barriers that the creatures had to cross to reach skin. None of these measures were truly effective, and everyone knew it. The centipedes were simply part of the environment, as unavoidable as the heat or the rain or the enemy himself. You could take precautions, but ultimately, survival was a matter of luck. The paralysis incidents also created a unique category of wounded in Vietnam. Men like Torres and Patterson were technically casualties. They had been incapacitated, evacuated, and required medical treatment, but their injuries didn't fit neatly into the existing classification system. They hadn't been wounded by the enemy. They hadn't been injured in accidents. They were victims of what military bureaucracy would eventually classify as environmental hazards. This classification had real consequences for years after the war. Veterans who had experienced paralysis incidents found it difficult to receive recognition or compensation for their experiences. The Veterans Administration was ill-equipped to deal with claims that didn't involve bullets or shrapnel, and many men found their claims for service-connected disability denied or minimized. It wasn't until decades later, when researchers began to take a more serious look at the full range of combat stressors, that the psychological impact of these incidents was properly acknowledged. Studies in the 1990s and 2000s found that soldiers who had experienced paralysis incidents showed rates of post-traumatic stress disorder comparable to those who had been wounded in combat, finding that surprised no one who had actually been there. The fear, after all, was rational. The paralysis incidents demonstrated something that every soldier in Vietnam knew instinctively: that danger was everywhere, that it could come from any direction, and that all their training, all their weapons, all their courage might not be enough to save them from a threat they never saw coming. In the end, the centipedes were just one part of a larger truth about the Vietnam War, that it wasn't simply a conflict between two human forces, but a war against an environment that was actively hostile to their presence. The jungle didn't take sides, but it didn't need to. Its inhabitants attacked indiscriminately, and American soldiers, far from home and already pushed to their limits, found themselves fighting a war on two fronts. If this story is touching something deep inside you, if you feel the weight of what these soldiers endured, then leave a comment right now saying, "I honor their courage and their sacrifice." Let me know that their stories matter to you, that these forgotten struggles deserve to be remembered. While the centipedes inspired fear with their size and their visible, dramatic attacks, the most deadly insects in Vietnam were almost too small to see. The mosquitoes of Southeast Asia would prove to be the greatest killer of American soldiers after the enemy himself, claiming lives and destroying health on a scale that dwarfed all other environmental threats combined. The numbers are staggering. During the peak years of American involvement, from 1965 to 1970, malaria alone hospitalized an estimated 100,000 servicemen, at certain times and in certain areas. Malaria was causing more casualties than combat, a fact that military commanders found both embarrassing and deeply frustrating. The mosquitoes that carried malaria were different from the varieties most American soldiers had encountered at home. The Anopheles mosquito, the primary vector for the malaria parasite, was smaller and more aggressive than its North American cousins. It bit primarily at night during the hours when exhausted soldiers were trying to sleep, and it was remarkably adept at finding exposed skin. The disease itself came in several forms, but the most common in Vietnam was Plasmodium falciparum, the most dangerous strain of malaria. Symptoms typically appeared 1 to 2 weeks after infection and included high fever, chills, profuse sweating, headache, nausea, and extreme fatigue. In severe cases, the parasite could attack the brain, causing cerebral malaria condition that could result in coma and death if not treated promptly. Even with treatment, malaria could be devastating. Soldiers who contracted the disease often required weeks of hospitalization and recovery, and many experienced recurrent episodes for years after leaving Vietnam. The parasite had a way of hiding in the liver, emerging periodically to cause new attacks of the disease, a reminder of the jungle that followed men home long after they had left it behind. The Army's response to the malaria threat was extensive but only partially successful. Soldiers were issued a weekly anti-malarial pill called chloroquine primaquine, which they were required to take under supervision. The pills were effective at preventing the most dangerous symptoms of malaria, but they had side effects that many soldiers found intolerable: nausea, stomach cramps, and vivid nightmares that interfered with already inadequate sleep. More problematic still, the malaria parasite was evolving. By the late 1960s, strains of drug-resistant malaria had begun to appear in Southeast Asia, rendering the standard prophylaxis less effective. Soldiers who had been taking their pills religiously found themselves falling ill anyway, their trust in military medicine badly shaken. The other major mosquito-borne threat was dengue fever, a viral infection that spread through the Aedes aegypti mosquito. Unlike the Anopheles, which fed primarily at night, the Aedes was a daytime hunter, making it impossible to avoid simply by using mosquito nets while sleeping. Dengue earned its nickname breakbone fever from the intense muscle and joint pain it caused. Soldiers who contracted the disease described feeling as though their bones were being crushed from the inside. The fever was high, often exceeding 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and the accompanying headache was frequently described as the worst sufferers had ever experienced. Unlike malaria, there was no prophylactic treatment for dengue. Once infected, soldiers could only ride out the symptoms, which typically lasted about a week, but left many men weak and debilitated for much longer. There was also the risk of dengue hemorrhagic fever, a severe and potentially fatal form of the disease that could develop, particularly in those who had been infected previously with a different strain. Private First Class Thomas Graham contracted dengue fever in August 1966, while serving with the 1st Infantry Division near Lakey. He would later describe his experience in a letter home that was preserved in the National Archives. "I thought I was dying. I really did. The fever wouldn't break, and every muscle in my body felt like it was being torn apart. The doc said there was nothing he could do except give me fluids and wait. That's the worst part, just waiting, knowing your body is fighting something you can't even see, wondering if you're going to make it through. I lay in that hospital bed for 4 days, and when I finally got up, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. It took 2 weeks before I felt anything like normal, and even then, I was weaker than I'd been before. The jungle doesn't just try to kill you, Mom. It tries to break you down, piece by piece." Graham survived, but his experience was repeated thousands of times across Vietnam. The mosquitoes were everywhere in the jungles and the rice paddies and the base camps and fire bases. Even in Saigon itself, there was no escaping them, and their constant attacks wore down even the most resilient soldiers. The psychological impact was significant. The knowledge that every mosquito bite might carry a potentially fatal disease added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. Some soldiers became obsessive about repellent and mosquito nets, while others adopted a fatalistic attitude, reasoning that there was no point in worrying about something so completely beyond their control. But the mosquitoes' impact went beyond individual suffering. The sheer number of malaria and dengue casualties affected military operations at every level. Units operating in high-risk areas frequently found themselves under strength, not because of enemy action, but because so many men were hospitalized or recovering from mosquito-borne illness. Commanders had to factor disease rates into their planning, knowing that a significant percentage of any force sent into the jungle would become non-effective due to illness. The medical corps struggled to keep up. Field hospitals were frequently overwhelmed with malaria and dengue patients, resources that might otherwise have been devoted to combat casualties. The competition for limited medical supplies created difficult choices. Should a soldier with malaria receive the same priority as one who had been wounded in action? There were also broader strategic implications. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were largely immune to the diseases that devastated American forces, not because they weren't infected, but because they had grown up in the environment and developed some degree of natural resistance. They had also evolved cultural practices, sleeping arrangements, clothing styles, even timing of activities that minimized exposure to the most dangerous mosquito species. American soldiers, by contrast, were newcomers to this ecosystem. Their bodies had no built-in defenses, and their training hadn't prepared them for the scope of the threat. They were fighting an enemy that had every advantage of home ground, including resistance to the microscopic killers that filled the air. The mosquito problem would never be fully solved during the war. Despite massive investments in prophylaxis, vector control, and medical treatment, the insects continued to exact their toll right up until the final American withdrawal. They were in the end simply too numerous, too omnipresent, and too well adapted to their environment to be defeated. Looking back, military medical experts would identify the mosquito-borne disease burden as one of the major logistical challenges of the Vietnam War, a challenge that was never adequately met. The official histories focus on battles and strategies, on political decisions and military maneuvers. But in the jungles of Southeast Asia, the real war was often fought in the dark when the mosquitoes emerged to hunt, and young American soldiers lay awake wondering which bite would be the one that changed their lives forever. Not all of the creatures that tormented American soldiers in Vietnam were venomous or disease-carrying. Some were simply persistent, ubiquitous, and maddening in their ability to make every moment of jungle life more miserable than it already was. The ants of Southeast Asia were perhaps the most underestimated threat. Several species inhabited the Vietnamese jungle, but the ones that caused the most problems for soldiers were the fire ants and the so-called army ants, massive colonies that moved through the forest floor in coordinated waves, consuming everything organic in their path. Fire ant attacks were common and invariably unpleasant. The ants built their nests in the ground, often in locations that soldiers chose for positions or rest stops without realizing what lay beneath. Disturbing a nest meant immediate, multiple stings from hundreds of aggressive insects, each sting injecting a venom that caused intense burning pain and raised welts that could last for days. Staff Sergeant Richard Hawkins, who served with the 101st Airborne Division, described an encounter that became legend in his unit. We were setting up a night ambush position, and one of my guys sat down right on a fire ant nest. He didn't even know what was happening at first, just started slapping at his legs like he was brushing off dirt. Then the screaming started. Those ants were all over him, in his pants, in his boots, everywhere. We had to strip him down right there in the jungle, pick the things off him one by one. He had over 100 stings. His legs swelled up so bad he couldn't walk for 2 days. The fire ant stings, while painful, were rarely dangerous to healthy adults. But in the jungle environment where any wound could become infected, even minor stings could lead to serious complications. The welts attracted secondary infections, and the constant scratching that the itching provoked created additional entry points for bacteria. The army ants were a different kind of threat. These massive columns, sometimes containing millions of individual insects, moved through the jungle floor like a living river, attacking anything that didn't get out of their way. Their bites were painful but not venomous. Instead, the threat came from their overwhelming numbers. Soldiers who inadvertently set up positions in the path of an army ant column would wake to find themselves covered in biting insects, a situation that could escalate from nuisance to emergency in minutes. The ants showed no fear of humans and would swarm over equipment into clothing and across exposed skin with complete indifference to the danger posed by their much larger victims. Private Benjamin Walker described his encounter with army ants in his memoir, published years after the war. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling like my whole body was on fire. I couldn't see anything, it was pitch black, but I could feel them crawling all over me, biting everywhere they could find skin. I jumped up and started running, but they were in my clothes and my hair and my ears. The other guys in my squad had to help me strip and pick them off. By the time we were done, I had bites covering probably half my body. The welts lasted for weeks. Walker's experience was dramatic, but not unique. Army ant columns were a known hazard of jungle operations, and experienced soldiers learned to recognize the signs of their approach, the particular sounds of their movement, the behavior of other animals fleeing ahead of them. But in the chaos of combat operations, such warnings were often missed or ignored, with painful consequences. Then there were the leeches. The Vietnamese jungle, particularly in the wetland areas of the Mekong Delta and during the monsoon season, was home to an abundance of leeches that attached themselves to any available host. Unlike the ants and centipedes, leeches weren't particularly painful. Their bites contained an anesthetic that numbed the skin, but they were psychologically disturbing and carried their own risks. Soldiers moving through flooded terrain or areas of heavy vegetation would often emerge to find multiple leeches attached to their bodies, having penetrated through boot eyelets, trouser seams, and any other available opening. Removing them improperly could cause the wounds to continue bleeding for hours, thanks to the anticoagulants in their saliva. The sight of a leech gorged with blood, swollen to several times its original size, clinging to one's own flesh was deeply disturbing to men who had grown up far from such creatures. Many soldiers developed a visceral revulsion to leeches that exceeded their fear of more dangerous organisms, a reaction that was perhaps irrational but entirely understandable. Corporal Michael Stevens, who served as a medic with the 25th Infantry Division, handled hundreds of leech removal procedures during his tour. The guys would come in with these things all over them, sometimes 10 or 15 at a time. You had to be careful removing them. If you just pulled, the head could stay in and cause an infection. We used cigarettes to burn them off, or sometimes a drop of salt. The worst was when they got somewhere you couldn't see inside the ear, up the nose. I had one guy come in with a leech that had crawled into his urethra. That was not a pleasant extraction for anyone involved. The leeches posed another, subtler threat as well. Their bites created open wounds that were susceptible to infection in the jungle environment. More significantly, some species of leech could transmit blood-borne pathogens between hosts, potentially spreading diseases through the population. The cumulative effect of all these smaller terrors was significant. Each individual encounter might have been minor, a few ant stings, a leech bite, a night disturbed by insects crawling across the face, but the effect was cumulative and relentless. Day after day, week after week, month after month, soldiers were subjected to an unending assault from creatures that seemed designed specifically to make their lives miserable. This constant harassment had measurable effects on morale and combat effectiveness. Soldiers who couldn't sleep properly because of fear of insects were soldiers who made mistakes during daylight operations. Men who were constantly scratching at bites and welts were men who were distracted from their primary mission. The insects didn't need to kill to do damage, they just needed to be there, always present, always waiting. The psychological literature that emerged from the Vietnam War would eventually recognize this phenomenon under various names: cumulative stress, environmental strain, the 1,000 cuts of jungle warfare. But during the war itself, the smaller terrors were rarely discussed officially. They were just part of the background, the constant misery that everyone endured but no one wanted to talk about. And yet, for many veterans, these smaller terrors would prove to be among their most vivid memories of the war. The human mind, it seems, remembered not just the moments of mortal danger, but also the grinding, daily misery of life in an environment that was hostile in every possible way. The insects weren't the enemy, but they were allies of no one ancient organisms going about their ancient business, indifferent to the human conflict unfolding around them. They would be there long after the last American soldier had left, after the last shots had been fired, after the jungle had reclaimed the fire bases and the trails and the scars of war. They were, in a sense, the true owners of that land. And the young men who came from so far away were merely temporary visitors in their domain. Private First Class Michael Torres returned to the United States in February 1968, 7 months after the centipede attack that had left him paralyzed for 5 hours. He carried no visible wounds, no Purple Heart, no medal that explained what he had experienced. His discharge papers listed his service as honorable and complete, with no mention of the day the jungle floor had risen up and struck him down. He went home to Los Angeles, to a country that was increasingly divided over the war he had fought, and he tried to resume a normal life. He got a job, met a woman, started a family. On the surface, everything was fine. But Torres never forgot the sensation of paralysis, the horror of being trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed commands. For years afterward, he would wake in the night convinced that he couldn't move, that the venom was still in his blood, that he was back in that jungle lying on the stretcher while his platoon carried him through hostile territory. He wasn't alone. Across the country, veterans were struggling with similar experiences, not the expected wounds of war, but the unexpected ones, the bites and stings and infections that had come from the environment itself. They were fighting battles that no one could see, against enemies that no one wanted to acknowledge. The medical establishment would be slow to recognize the full scope of what these men had endured. For decades, the focus remained on combat trauma, on wounds inflicted by bullets and shrapnel, on the psychological damage caused by killing and watching friends die. The environmental threats, the insects, the diseases, the parasites, were secondary concerns at best. It wasn't until the 1990s that researchers began to take a more comprehensive view of the Vietnam veteran experience. Studies of veterans' health revealed patterns that couldn't be explained by combat exposure alone. Men who had never been wounded in action showed elevated rates of chronic illness, psychological disturbance, and unexplained physical symptoms. Many of these issues traced back to the environmental hazards they had faced: malaria that still flared up decades later, tissue damage from venomous bites, immune system disruptions from repeated infections. The centipede paralysis incidents, in particular, began to receive new attention. Dr. Sarah Chun, a toxicologist at UCLA who specialized in envenomation cases, published a groundbreaking paper in 1997 that examined the long-term effects of giant centipede venom on human neurology. Her findings suggested that even temporary paralysis could cause lasting changes in the nervous system, subtle alterations in nerve function that might not be immediately apparent but could manifest as chronic pain, hypersensitivity, or anxiety disorders years later. What we're seeing, Dr. Chun wrote, is that the venom doesn't just cause acute symptoms and then disappear. It may fundamentally alter the way the nervous system processes signals, creating vulnerabilities that persist long after the original exposure. For veterans who experienced paralysis incidents, this could explain a range of symptoms that have never been adequately addressed. Her work was controversial but influential. It helped push the Veterans Administration toward a more comprehensive understanding of environmental injuries, opening the door for veterans to receive recognition and treatment for conditions that had previously been dismissed or denied. Sergeant William Hayes, the platoon leader who had supervised Torres's evacuation back in 1967, became an advocate for greater recognition of environmental injuries after his own retirement from the military. He spent years lobbying for changes in VA policy and speaking at veterans events about the hidden threats that soldiers had faced. "We were told we were going to fight the Viet Cong," Hayes said at a 2003 veterans reunion. "Nobody told us we were also going to fight the jungle itself. Nobody told us about the centipedes that could leave you paralyzed, or the mosquitoes that could put you in the hospital for weeks, or the ants that could swarm over you in the middle of the night. We learned about those things the hard way, and a lot of guys are still paying the price." Hayes died in 2015, but his advocacy had lasting effects. The following year, the VA expanded its recognition of environmental injuries to include a broader range of insect and arachnid attacks, making it easier for veterans to establish service connection for conditions related to these exposures. But for many veterans, the recognition came too late. Michael Torres passed away in 2008 from complications related to chronic liver disease, a condition that may or may not have been connected to the malaria he had contracted during his time in Vietnam. He had never fully escaped the jungle. It had followed him home, hiding in his blood, waiting to claim him decades after his service had ended. Saints of Vietnam would continue their ancient cycles long after the war ended. The giant centipedes still hunt in the same forests where Torres was bitten, their venom as potent as ever. The mosquitoes still swarm at dusk, carrying the same diseases that hospitalized 100,000 American soldiers. The ants still march in their countless millions, and the leeches still wait in the muddy waters. The jungle has no memory of the war that was fought beneath its canopy. It doesn't remember the young Americans who came from so far away, who bled and suffered and died in its embrace. It doesn't remember the paralyzed soldiers carried on stretchers, the men screaming from centipede bites, the thousands lying in hospital beds with malarial fevers. But we remember. We must remember, because these stories are part of the complete truth of that conflict, a truth that goes beyond tactics and strategies, beyond political debates and historical controversies. It includes the experience of fighting not just the enemy but the environment itself, of learning that in some places on this earth nature itself is arranged against human presence. The soldiers who served in Vietnam knew this truth intimately. They lived it every day in every mosquito bite and leech attachment and ant sting and centipede attack. They learned that the jungle was not a neutral space but an active participant in their suffering, and they bore that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. Today, the jungles of Vietnam are largely peaceful. The old battlefields have grown over. The bomb craters have filled with water. The burned villages have been rebuilt or abandoned. American tourists visit the same places where their fathers and grandfathers fought. Walking trails that were once sites of ambush and horror. But the insects remain, they will always remain. And somewhere in those forests, a Vietnamese giant centipede waits in a rotting log, ready to defend its territory against any intruder, a living link to a war that the jungle has already forgotten. The story of the insects that paralyzed American soldiers isn't just a story about biology or military medicine. It's a story about the limits of human power, about the humility that comes from confronting an environment that refuses to be conquered. The United States sent its most advanced technology and its bravest young men to Vietnam, and both were brought low by creatures that had been perfecting their survival strategies for millions of years. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that courage and technology are not enough to overcome a hostile world, that nature operates on its own schedule and according to its own rules, and that anyone who enters the jungle must accept its terms or suffer the consequences. The veterans who survived Vietnam's insects came home with that knowledge written in their flesh, and the scars from centipede bites, and the recurring fevers from malaria, and the memories of paralysis and pain that would never fully fade. They paid a price that is rarely acknowledged in the formal histories of the war, a price exacted not by the enemy but by the land itself. And now you know their story. Now you understand what they faced, not just from the soldiers on the other side, but from the crawling, biting, stinging multitudes that filled every shadow and waited in every hidden space. You understand why the word jungle became a synonym for nightmare in the vocabulary of Vietnam veterans. Why men who had faced enemy fire without flinching would shudder at the memory of a centipede emerging from a rotting log. This is the truth they brought home with them, a truth written in venom, in fever, in 5-hour paralysis that felt like eternity. It is a truth that deserves to be remembered because it is part of who they were, part of what they endured, and part of why we owe them our recognition and our gratitude. If you watched this far, it's because this story moved you, because you understand that these men deserve to be remembered for everything they've faced, not just the battles that made the history books. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you, so I can see who truly appreciates the stories we tell on this channel. If this story touched you, if it gave you a new understanding of what these soldiers endured, then please like this video and share it with others who need to hear it. History isn't just about the famous battles and the celebrated victories, it's about the complete truth of what happened, and the men who lived through it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. We tell the stories that history forgot, the truths that are too painful to print in textbooks, the experiences of ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances. Every week, we bring you another chapter of history that you won't find anywhere else. Subscribe, hit the bell, and join our community of people who believe that every soldier's story deserves to be told.